So Richard Chancellor ended up in this place. There was just a little monastery and about 5 or 6 houses. He had no idea where he was, but when he walked on the shore, the fishermen that saw him groveled, fell down, banged their heads, Russian style. They thought it was a person from another planet.
So tell me, what is the climate like in Ivan's court? What do the English think of what Ivan's got going on there?
Well, it was all glitter and gold because Ivan was informed that the strangers that arrived from a country called England, the wealth of Ivan was all on display. He had 7 crowns that he rotated throughout the very long dinner.
That's like Anne Hathaway at the Oscars.
Right. So Russia became very important for England. So Elizabeth never wanted to lose their friendship, and it became even more important as the West realized Russia's importance as the buffer between Turkey and the rest of Europe.
Folks, I am so delighted. Today we are joined by Rima Greenhill, I should say Dr. Rima Greenhill, a senior lecturer in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures at Stanford University, one of my best friends and mentors. She is a lady in the streets and a tiger in the archives, and she's going to be talking to us today about this wonderful book, Shakespeare, Elizabeth, and Ivan, the role of English-Russian relations in Love's Labour's Lost. And Rima, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me on your channel, Phoebe.
So let's just dive right in. What inspired you to write this wonderful book?
Well, I come to Shakespeare from the point of history, and I think what motivated me most were the similarities that I saw between the real life event in the Russian-English exchange and things that were happening on Shakespeare's stage and his page, on the page as well. So I wanted to share that. I didn't think of writing a book to start with. I kept presenting one paper after another at conferences. After about 4 presentations, I realized I just couldn't do justice to the new material because too much time was taken up by giving the historical background. So after about the 4th or 5th talk, I realized I have to write a book. And the book will be my basis to which I can refer the readers or the listeners at the conferences. And I won't have to repeat the more sort of glaring aspects of it or more sort of the events that people will already know. And then I can point to them. I don't have to give a lot of background because each one of the points may not be much on its own. So I just need quite a number of points to make my point.
Wow. That's powerful. No, the cumulative effect is very real. And I think Oxfordians in general can really empathize because so many times people will ask you, well, how do you know what's the one, smoking gun fact? Whereas it's like you're doing such subtle, delicate work and it does kind of build up over time. And so, well, I hope this interview will end up being another thing that you can kind of point people towards when you're tired of repeating yourself. So I'm really grateful to be able to be recording wonderful thoughts. But I just remember you had a wonderful story. It was sort of a eureka moment that came as you kind of a collision between your love of Oxfordianism and Shakespeare and your deep, deep knowledge of Russian languages. If you could just kind of describe that moment that inspired the insight.
I think it was a word, sable. I knew that Russia was associated with sables, and England bought sables through Hanseatic traders, but sables came from Siberia. And they were one of the staple items of gifts from Ivan the Terrible to the queens, first to Queen Mary, because his very first ambassador came during the time of Queen Mary. He came in 1556, 57. So, so the fact that Armado, who's supposedly a Spaniard, is talking about sables, it just seemed strange. And it was very intriguing that Armado, being a Spaniard, in one act, he says, I swear by the salt wave of the Mediterranean. And in another act, he says, by the North Pole. So that was a conflict already of nationalities there and geographic locations.
Fascinating. Okay, so the character of Armado, and
Armand,
there's a line where he says he's talking about Sable, and that's
well, he didn't just say sable. He said that he was plagued by depression, sable-colored melancholy, which pushes him to want to come to the court of Navarre, a foreign court. And so not only Shakespeare knew that sables were from Russia, but there are different colors of sables, and the best ones are very dark ones. So it's interesting, those little details, since I'm a linguist by training and historian by design, by love of history, I, um, I kind of spotted those things. So I started with Armado, and then little by little, other characters became apparent to me.
great. So your book kind of goes about how Love's Labor's Lost is talks a lot about covertly this trade negotiation, this ongoing back and forth between Tsar Ivan the Terrible and Queen Elizabeth in the 1570s, correct? The 70s is what we're talking about?
Well, it started in England, ended up in Russia in 1553. So the first years were the exchange with Queen Mary.
Right. Wow.
Which in the Russian archives, interestingly, there's more talk about King Philip and Mary kind of second, but that's because women at that time didn't get much attention.
Right.
And in Russia, even less than in England, because at least in England, there were a couple of queens. So, but in Russia, the Tsarinas were sitting in their building called Terium, and they were not seen or heard.
I wanted to back it up even farther ahead of Mary, actually, because I love this passage that you had in your book, like an incredible quote. And it's from when Edward the Sixth is dying. Kind of one of his final things that he does when he's alive is him or his advisors release this statement. And I thought it was beautiful because it's all about trade. And, when we're talking about Love's Labor's Lost and a love story about trade negotiations, which maybe seems sort of silly or weird because what do those things have to do with one another? But I'm just going to read this passage from your book that came from Edward as he's dying, and he's talking about his enthusiasm for trade. Every man desireth to join friendship with other, to love and be loved, and also to give and receive mutual benefits. Our fathers and predecessors have ever gently and lovingly entreated such as a friendly mind came to them, merchants who wandering about the world search both the land and the sea, to carry such good and profitable things as are found in their countries to remote regions and kingdoms, and again to bring from the same for such things as they find there commodious for their own countries. For the God of heaven and earth, greatly providing for mankind, would not that all things should be found in one region, to the end that one should have need of one another, and that this by the means of friendship might be established among all men, and everyone seek to gratify all. So I just thought that was such a beautiful passage, and it really speaks to, when we think about the age of exploration, you write a lot about the establishment of the Muscovy Company, the world's first, as it were, corporation. And, people think about colonialism and this very extractive, exploitative, which to some degree maybe it was, but I just thought it was really interesting to kind of start our love story with what seems like a real declaration of love. So can you talk about, so that I guess is the beginning, right? That's the kind of intention, or that's the highest possible, what ends up actually happening when England really does start to trade with Russia? They send envoys to Russia. Do they find something that's as beautiful and wonderful as that sentiment that's expressed by Edward VI? What do they find?
So when that sentiment, which is like a thesis on economics, is written, the three ships that are sailing from England in search of China have no idea what people, what nations they will meet on the way. And so this was like letter of appeal to whoever is going to be met on the way to encourage trade because,
Mm.
as you know, Spain and Portugal, got in all the best sources for their profits, and England was lagging behind in this department. And so, the English merchants wanted to rule the waves, and they
Right, they're way
made
behind, for
new
example, the New
markets.
World, which is
Yeah,
1492. So this is 50 years later and they're behind.
right. And so finally, during the time of Edward VI, there was a new company formed, um, a very new joint stock company. The whole idea was very new because before, if you wanted to trade, you had to travel to those countries and trade. Well, with joint stock company, you just had to contribute the money and someone else did the sailing and trading for you. And
Mm.
so uh, courtiers and members of the court realize this is going to be very profitable. We can do it. All we need to do is chip in 25 pounds and we're in. So initially in 1553, the contributions were towards equipping the ships, putting in victuals for the journey, supplying the sailors, and so on. The company was formed 2 years later after the expedition returned, having not found China but bumped into Russia instead,
Crazy. Oops.
not without sacrifices, because two ships and their crew were lost, and only one ship somehow by accident managed to end up in the Russian north. At the time that Ivan the Terrible was the ruler, was searching for an outlet to a sea, but he knew he had the Black Sea. He knew there was a Baltic Sea, and that wasn't run by Muscovy, by Russia at the time. I mean, he had to fight his neighbors to get an outlet to the sea. So, and that was very difficult. His father wanted an outlet, his grandfather, but the attempts were not successful. He didn't even consider that the North Sea, the White Sea, is actually a way to Europe. And
Mm.
so when the English arrived in 1553, the leader of the expedition was Richard Chancellor, a marvelous, incredible navigator and captain, and someone who became envoy, first envoy. So Richard Chancellor ended up in this place. There was just a little monastery and about 5 or 6 houses. He had no idea where he was, but when he stepped on the shore, the fishermen that saw him, they ran up to him and they, because they thought it was a person from another planet. So they
Yeah.
basically groveled, fell down, banged their heads, Russian style, on the ground, and they thought that he was going to kill them because he arrived on this humongous ship that no Russian people ever saw. I mean, there were Russian boats, but nothing so big. It was like 170 ton boat. And the chancellor just dispelled their fears, showed them with gestures that they're not in danger, that he wants to trade, he wants to see their ruler. He found out it's Ivan the Terrible who's in Moscow. And he made a journey of 1,500 miles from that area, which is now the area where Archangelsk is. At that time, there was no Archangelsk. Ivan built it in 1583. not build it himself, but he gave permission to the Dutch people to build a proper harbor for all the ships that would be sailing from all over Europe. Anyway, so 1,500 miles, it's like the distance from England to Russia. He had to do it via mainland to get to Moscow, and then ended up at Ivan's court.
Tell me, what is the climate like in Ivan's court? What do the English think of what Ivan's got going on there?
So the first few ambassadors, they left them memoirs. Richard Chancellor, his memoir exists, although it wasn't written by him because unfortunately he died on his second journey to Russia while carrying Ivan's first ambassador to England in
Oh.
1556. So he perished. He jumped the,
He saved Nepia's life. That's Chancellor.
he saved the Russian envoy's life. And he lost his own as well as the life of his son as well. Anyway, so when he arrived, the first time, it was overwhelming, but Chancellor didn't show it that he was overwhelmed. But of course, the court that had time to prepare because Ivan was informed by his administrators in the north that the strangers that arrived from a country called England. So he was expecting them. And the court was, what did they find? Well, it was all glitter and gold because the wealth of Ivan was all on display. He was wearing clothes made out of golden cloth. He had 7 crowns that he rotated throughout the very long dinner.
That's like Anne Hathaway at the Oscars.
Right.
That's yeah.
He was surrounded by hundreds of people who were having dinner with him, and they were all dressed in these golden clothes the plates were all silver and gold, real gold. Everything was so luscious and rich. And Ivan made a lot of fuss about the English because he was very interested in how they managed to get through to his country. And he wanted contact with the West. So he gave Richard Chancellor to take back with him letter to Edward VI saying, you can have all the privileges you want, don't have to pay any taxes, don't have to pay any import duties, export duties. Just, tell your merchants they can come here anytime, we'll be very happy. And that's how the Muscovy Company, which it sounds like it was Russian company, it was actually English company, formed in 1555, approved by Queen Mary. This was the company that got the monopoly of trade with Russia. That was the beginning of it, and then Chancellor went back and was carrying with him the Russian ambassador, and that's when the shipwreck took place, and he perished. And then other ambassadors followed. But what did they think? Well, initially they thought the world of Ivan. They saw in what honor, what respect was given to him. They wrote back to Elizabeth that this was the ruler that was much feared but loved. Things changed afterwards, but initially they couldn't tell that those rich clothes that 200 people sharing dinner with them wore, they were not their own clothes. They were clothes that belonged to Ivan's wardrobe, and they were on loan. And after wearing them, they had to be cleaned by the people who borrowed them and returned. So, of course, Russia was very exotic, and there's all the new customs. And Ivan seemed like a ruler who knew all his subjects by first name. All those people surrounding him, he would call out their names. He would send a piece of bread to them. He would drink from the goblet and pass it on to the newcomers, to the new arrivals. So they were really taken with him, and they saw that Russia was extremely rich. Of course, then gradually, the more people came and the more of the country was seen, of course, they saw the big contrast between the Kremlin and between Ivan's wealth and how the rest of the country lived. And the
What language are they communicating in? Latin?
no, they had no, because Ivan didn't know Latin. Elizabeth wrote to him in Latin. Sometimes the first letter, um, the letter of Edward the Sixth was written in four languages,
Hmm.
and Latin and Greek, and but not in Russian. They didn't anticipate meeting. It,
Right. I mean, it's so crazy. Like, if anything, it's almost a very benign interaction, it sounds like, compared to, what happens all around. I was just reading The Tempest yesterday, and there's the line where they're talking about, oh, people in England will, they'll spend money to see a dead Indian, but they won't give, money to a beggar. And I love, I think it's Margot Anderson's book where it was, or I'm not sure, it might be somebody else's research that it was saying that it was like they kind of gotten an Inuit person and they sort of put him on display in England, like sort of like in a zoo kind of thing. Obviously, what's going on with the Spaniards and the New World is really crazy. I actually recently I saw they did in San Francisco a production of Pacific Overtures, the Stephen Sondheim musical, which I think you would have found very cute, but it's about like, yeah, when America tries to start trade negotiations with Japan and it's just two worlds colliding, and the same thing where they see a ship showing up and they think it's people from another planet. So all things considered, like it does seem like things could have gone a lot worse. I was really interested in your book when it's like reading about how the Tatars, I guess, before Ivan had been very anti, they just hadn't been about opening up or communicating with the rest of the world. And it just feels compared to England, like Ivan's choosing brides out of bride parades or something, like the story of Queen Esther from the Bible. And like, even I'm always really interested in this idea that like there's in England, because it's Christian, the Christian West, they don't have harems for the king, but like then they have to sort of find workarounds like cutting off heads and divorce and stuff. And so Ivan also is in like a Christian country, but has talk to me about Ivan's love life, and then we're going to get more into him and Elizabeth.
Right. Well, so not just Ivan, all Russian czars until the time of Peter the Great, they chose their wives from uh, bride parades, including Michael Romanov, the first.
So we have a pride parade, but
And
in Russia it would have been a bride parade.
bride parade, that's right. And so, so this was a Byzantine custom. And of course, Ivan associated himself with Byzantine Empire. His grandfather married the niece of the last Byzantine emperor. And so his grandmother was Greek, and the double eagle was the insignia of Byzantine emperors. So there were bride parades, and every time he chose from well, not exactly every time, because two of his wives were daughters of the lords of particular Tatar clans. So there were four major ones. And so they offered him Maria Nagaya, that's the seventh wife of Ivan the Terrible. And her name, Nagaya, comes from the tribal name, the Nagais, although they're usually spelled with N-O-G, whereas Nagaya was spelled with N-A-G. But anyway, one of the envoys to Russia, Giles Fletcher, certainly knew about it, because in his book that he wrote in 1591 called Of the Rus Commonwealths, the book where he describes the Russian state, how it is run, all about the ruling elite, about the religion, about geography, and so on. He also talks there about the Tatars that inhabit Russian territories and outside. And so he actually explains, Fletcher explains that Nagaya means naked in Russian. And of course, we have an episode in Love's Labour's Lost where Kostad invites Armado to duel, and Armado says, "Oh, I can't take off my jacket because I'm naked under my shirt and under my jacket." And then the courtiers make a comment. Yes, he's carrying the dishcloth of Jacquanetta as a favor. Well, Jacquanetta, as I explain in the book, is modeled on Maria Nagaya, who was the subject of Ivan that Ivan married. And so this is like one of those connections where life reflects what's in the play, or rather the play reflects what was happening in real life.
Great. So let's get into it. So you have a quote that you translated that's from a Russian historian who was kind of compiling the correspondence between England and Russian diplomats during this time period. And I love their quote. They said, to tell the full story, it needed a playwright the caliber of Shakespeare. So can you tell us, what are some anecdotes from Elizabeth and Ivan's ill-fated courtship that feel particularly Shakespearean? All these kind of miscommunications and these wacky episodes. Can you give us a little bit of insight into what feels so Shakespearean?
Well, so firstly, I mean, the historian, his name was Nikolai Bestuzhev-Ryumin, and he was asked by the Tsar to compile the history of Russia. And that he was looking through those documents, the correspondence, and there are over 200 letters were written between the two courts within the space of 50 years or so. And so he just saw that the exchange had dramatic potential, like real dramatic potential for a play about this relationship. And the relationship was it's both comical and tragical. And so Bestuzhev-Ryumin, who knew Russian plays, because in the 19th century, just as nowadays, Shakespeare is Russia's favorite foreign playwright and poet. So he saw, that he knew a bit how Shakespeare wrote, and he thought, oh, this is the person who could do it justice. No one else could. And so, so Love's Labour's Lost has a lot of comical episodes there.
I love when it was crazy. You describe it as surreal in the book, the kind of some of these interactions. So basically, Ivan is trying to marry Queen Elizabeth like every other prince, I guess, in town. And so she's sort of entertaining him the way she's kind of continuing to drag things out with every other prince in town as part of this, as part of her trade tactics. And so I think he doesn't write things down, but he has one of his envoys come and verbally basically asks to marry her. And in order to get out of this awkward situation, she pretends, oh, sorry, you can't, I must have misunderstood what you said. I know I couldn't have understood what you said, right? And then it takes basically it defers them another year for that to go back across the White Sea and then to come back with another answer, as Ivan, I think, is getting increasingly desperate to have, he wants asylum because he thinks his people are going to rise up and kill him. So he wants to just get out and have a place where he can go and be safe. Okay. So you talk about Love's Labour's Lost. You said it earlier. There's sort of a palimpsestic quality where it seems like it was updated to fit different contexts. So, Felicia Landre, you cite as saying after the defeat of the Spanish Armada, when we first see the first quarto come out of Love's Labour's Lost, it just has these sort of commedia dell'arte names like the braggart, the wench, whatever. And then later, after the defeat of the Spanish Armada, suddenly the braggart becomes our motto. But you think that there was a point in time previously when this character in particular was Tsar Ivan the Terrible. And that people who saw this as a court entertainment, maybe in the 70s, would have read this as, you know, a spoof, like a Saturday Night Live style spoof of this failed trade negotiation. So can you talk a little bit more about how you came to that conclusion?
Right. So the first edition of Love's Labour's Lost, the original, um, the very first one that we have is 1598. And in that edition, the courtiers have their names, the women have their names, but what I call the Russian contingent. In other words, those people that most scholars call the rustics. And that's Kostad, Holofernes, the curate, boy, clown, Kostad. So they don't have their names. Well, Nathaniel is mentioned there, and I think Holofernes, but not the others. Moss is boy and Kostad is clown. So 1598, we don't have the names, and I think using the characters from Italian Commedia dell'arte was very convenient for the author because every time you needed to change things, to do a rewrite, to flip something, to make it work for a particular political agenda that Elizabeth had, then you just didn't have to change names. Now, the names for the Russian contingent, as I call them, appear in the first folio. And there we already have the names. But Armada was braggart, and Holofernes was pedant before. But then we have all the names in place. Okay, so yes. So your question was, how do I see the layers and so on?
Yeah.
So
Which are crazy. It's such a trip because you obviously have the French court names and Navarre. Then later you get the Spanish coming in. You're talking about the Ivan layer. So it's really a millefeuille cake.
Yeah, it's palimpsest, as you say. I think it's a brilliant way to describe it.
Thank you. That I was like, I pulled that word out. I'm like, I get to say that once a year, and I'm like, palimpsest. Pew, pew, pew. Like, nailed it.
Exactly. Yeah, so many layers. You have to peel, and that's how I was doing, peeling them one by one. So one of the layers, and it's not the first one, in my opinion, is that's when we have Ivan there. And we don't yet have Holofernes and Nathaniel because they come in Act 4. They appear very late. But the first 3 acts, we have Moss, we have Kostad, and we have Armado. Armado, based on Ivan, who died in 1584. So after 1584, relationship between England and Russia changed significantly. If Ivan was suing for friendship with Elizabeth, for marriage to her, for marriage with one of her noble women, as he was quoting.
Mary Hastings, who'd once been engaged to Edward de Vere.
Yes, exactly, the one who was engaged. And that was another reason why I got interested in, doing presentations, because I saw, Edward de Vere.
Yeah, so basically they're like, well, you can't marry Elizabeth, but we can give you another noble woman, Lady Mary Hastings. And they're like, great, can we draw a painting of her so we can send it back home? And they're like, she's actually really sick with smallpox right now, and so you can't see her. So they keep playing these evasive tactics.
Well, exactly. So here is, Nikolai Bestujev-Ryumin, he's reading all this correspondence. He just think, oh my goodness, there's this comedy going on. They call each other my beloved sister, my beloved brother. He's asking for her love, I just want you to give me love, and so on. And she swears that, he's her beloved brother. And so that's on the surface, but underneath, there are all kinds of problems, and he withdraws privileges, Ivan, then he reinstates them. So of course, this historian just thought, well, that's great material for a play. And Elizabeth is a model for the princess. So when the princess criticizes the insincerity of the letters she receives, she says this is bombast as lining to the times. So she calls those letters of love that men send and where they swear love to women forever and ever. She just sees that as bombast. But bombast actually in 16th century was a name of material which was used as a lining for clothes. So, as you know, in my book, I talk a lot about the goods that were exchanged, the
Fascinating.
materials, number of materials that are mentioned. I mean, even the word, not just kersey, which we know now, but russet was a name of particular type of material too.
Wow,
Now
russet, that
we
makes
just
total sense.
think of
I was
russet.
blown away by the fact that the Russian lint, the flax became what they used for linen for the English naval ships. So I'm like, that is very non-trivial if this trade exchange is giving them literally what they're going to build their ships with for the Navy.
Yeah, so England exported from Russia and imported Russian raw materials. Um, and among them, was wax. That was very important for Elizabeth too. She was buying huge amounts of Russian wax. So such large amounts, then when Ivan died and his son became the ruler and the relationship changed, Elizabeth became kind of a suitor to the Russian government. Well, Fyodor the First, the son of Ivan the Terrible, he made wax material to be exchanged for military supplies. It wasn't like that under Ivan, but I mean, wax became material that Russians didn't want to export anymore.
Mm.
So England bought wax, it bought tallow, and it bought hemp for cordage and for rigging the English ships with until so English actually when they arrived in Russia they opened rope factories. They taught the Russians to make rope out of
Wow.
their um, hemp and that was superior rope, much more superior to Hanseatic League, which was selling to England their rope before. So Russia became very important for England, and so Elizabeth didn't never wanted to lose their friendship, and it became even more important as the West realized Russia's importance as the buffer between Turkey and the rest of Europe.
Mm.
Because at this time, Spain was petrified of Turkey. Turkey and Spain were the enemies, and Russia would just say, "Oh, we're going to sell our raw materials to Spain," and of course, Spain is the enemy of England, so England didn't want to lose trade. Well, and then as you know, I was describing how other foreign traders came in trying to pull the rug under the English merchants' feet, the Dutch, the English, the Italians. And of course, they're all satirized in the book, but it's kind of hidden. The names of the major competitors are hidden quite cleverly. Um, it's amazing the way Shakespeare knows all the nitty-gritty details.
Clearly, the Russians make a splash. And you had such great citations of, obviously in Love's Labor's Lost, you see them, there's the Mask of the Russians in Act 5 where they come out, they're speaking in Russian accents, they're dressed like Russians. Um, and that felt very topical at the time. I almost had the thought of it's almost like, in the moon landing or something where it kind of like seeps into pop culture. And I'm sure like lots of people at times in conversation or in art or comedians were making jokes about the moon landing. So you have these great examples where not only Shakespeare is referencing Russians and them showing up. Philip Sidney, one of in Astrophil and Stella, there's a line where he's talking about like slave, like he's not going to be a slave like Muscovite, and you say that that's probably written around the time that the Russians are in court. There's a John Webster and Thomas Dekker.
Yeah, Catherine Duncan Jones claims that that sonnet was written in 1583, and that's the time when the Russian ambassador Fyodor Pisimsky was at court. Yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah, and so even in John Webster and Thomas Dekker both have plays separately that reference very specifically this like torture punishment of beating people on the shins that was happening in Russia. And so it sort of makes you think that there was this kind of gossip or this sensational news going around about this sort of backward nation where they were, brutalizing people with this shin thing, which you say also shows up in Love's Labor's Lost. They're talking about this shin beating.
Yes, yes. Well, Russia was seen exotic, but it's similar to Turkey in a way that the punishments were very cruel and severe. And the punishment that seemed to have caught on not caught on in England, but caught on by the English writers was that beating on the shins, because in Russia, people were punished for not paying their debts. And the way to get the money out of them was by beating them on the shins, and not just once. I mean, they would have to show up every day, and they would be beaten over and over on the same bruises, on the same.
Can you imagine if Edward de Vere, his deaths, if he'd lived in Russia? That would have been a brutal, brutal thing to see.
Yes, well, he didn't live there, but he knew the envoys very well. And this was mentioned by certainly by the envoys. The books were written by Giles Fletcher about Russia, and he was talking about punishments there. Other envoy, Horsey, reported people's dismemberment and even, eating them for a word, like boiling them. Apparently, there was a human size frying pan available. So Ivan devised very cruel punishments, and he kind of replicated things that people would experience in hell. And he felt that he was a representative of God on earth. And so the punishments, okay, we won't talk about that because that's too pleasant. But yeah, but
I'd encourage people to pick up the book if they want to read more Ivan the Terrible Punishments, because some of them go into detail and they're pretty vivid.
Yeah, but there were like things like Russian clothes were also very interesting to the writers. So you have Thomas Nash in Pierce Penniless. He's talking about a lawyer who is wearing a hat, Muscovite fashion. So the same Thomas Nash enjoys the fact that in Russian Orthodox faith, the most frequently repeated prayer is God have mercy on me, so on us. And so Nash in Russian is nas. So, Господи помилуй нас, God have mercy on us. the last word is the way the English envoys pronounce the Russian word. So he sees the repetition of his surname, his family name, in the Russian prayer. And he plays, it's like play on words that he plays
Wow.
with. Then you have, writers, of course, mentioning drunkenness. You have George Tuberville, who went
Right. Oh, that poem was great. Yes.
who wrote 3 letters from Russia to his English friends. And he describes in a poetic form the wardrobe that of Russian wardrobe. And of course, the envoys would be familiar with that wardrobe because they would be dressed up in those clothes and smuggled at night to see Ivan the Terrible. And they would be wearing Russian clothes, which one of them said he felt very uncomfortable in and very cold.
Hmm.
But so the clothes and you know punishments, I think they are the most
They went viral. People really,
vile.
they were memes. Like people really got that was sort of what people associated with it.
Yeah,
High fashion and brutal punishment, and then that stuff kind of made
punishments.
news.
Yeah. So we read. I think Thomas Dekker is talking about, ironically, like about this punishment. Oh, it's a great. This is great.
Yeah.
A great custom they have in Russia, but of course he means it ironically. And of course, so Kostad, which means head, which means apple, and a euphemism for head. So Kostad colloquially meant head. Of course, Kostad gets hit by, well, Kostad, who I believe is modeled on Ivan's son, Ivan Ivanovich, his oldest son, who got hit in the head by his father. It was just a really tragic incident. Ivan didn't mean to kill his son. It was just flew into a rage and he hit him. And the stick that Ivan carried, a metal stick, had sharp things on the end, which went into the head of his son. So he was destroyed by it. That led to his death at the age of 54. And in March of 1584 in the West it was still, in England it was still 83. But anyway, but after that time, I'm kind of coming back to what I started saying a while ago. So after that time, the relationship got worse with his heirs, with Fyodor, and then with Godunov, although at the beginning they were good with Godunov, then they got worse. And so um, laughing at Russians the way they're being mocked in Act 5 in the Russian Mask, it was no longer on. And so presenting Armado as a Spaniard rather than just a braggart who could have been Ivan, it wasn't on because, as I see it, Elizabeth used the plays as her foreign policy promotion piece. And she would show them, she'd put them on when she had foreign dignitaries visiting her. So, for example, I describe 3 masks which played on her stage the very first Christmas she became the queen. And there are 3 masks, not plays, and we don't have the text of them anymore. But the title suggests to me they're about Russia. And the Russians were the enemies of Sweden. And she has this brother, half brother of the Swedish uh, king elect, who becomes king the following year, visiting in London. And what does she put on? She puts on a mask that is obviously about Russians. It's a mask of the Musquas, well, Muscovites, and Moskwa That's how they called Moscow in those
Yeah.
early
And
years.
Exotica was a big hit in court, right? Like they have the one where they're all in painted black or whatever under King James, and like Susan Vere and all these people are in it. So they
Right.
loved those sort of spectacles and things.
Yes, and
And
then
I, one of my favorite things in the book is you talk about actually the Venetian ambassador is writing home enraged that the who is it who's being made fun of? I forget if it's the
the
Spanish
second,
Philip II, he's saying, hey, bro, you're going to hate this. They're laughing at you. They're laughing at you in court. They're parodying you. And so I love the power that that imposes, you know, because it's like, think, oh, they're just making jokes. But this was explosive. And this idea that mockery and satire and poetry and art and playwriting could be used as this propaganda weapon so formidably is incredibly it's incredibly thought provoking. So just to wrap it up, you know, the Love's Labor's Lost has an unusual ending. Jack doesn't get Jill. It's not an end of a love story. There's sort of echoing the kind of sad end of the English and Russian. They don't end up together. So can you just wrap up how that story ends diplomatically for us?
yes, so the men want to marry women, and women say, no, you've been perjured too much. You broke your word too many times. Of course, Ivan and the French king too, Henry IV, broke his word to Elizabeth. So she says, the princess says, no, what you should do, let's wait for a year, to prove, and then we'll meet and, we'll see if we still love each other. We'll be together. And of course, each woman sends her um, paramour to different locations, and Rosaline wants Biron to go to some distant, freezing hermitage or hospital and use his wit on people who are sick and see if he can make them laugh and make their life easier. So, yeah, so why is it waiting for a year? Well, the Russians and the English could only meet once a year because the sea, White Sea, was covered in ice. So
Mm.
the journey would take place in spring, and then the English envoys would arrive in Russia in the summer, and ideally, you know, bought what they needed, sold what they needed, and they would sail back not later than September, and return to England. But it very rarely happened. They usually had to stay a whole year until the ice melted, and then they returned the following late spring or early summer to England. So this is, yeah, so the Russians, Ivan didn't marry Elizabeth. It didn't work out. But she never wanted to say to him it would never happen. So every envoy would come
It's
up
not me, it's you. Or no, wait, it's not you, it's me.
continuation of the story that, oh, yes, sorry, Lady Mary Hastings couldn't marry you because she's very sick, very weak. She won't survive the journey, and her relatives and friends can't bear to part with her. But the queen has 10 more eligible relatives who are virgins, and I'm sure you'll find Zarina number
Maybe
8.
they have another parade.
Yeah. So that's why it's another year. So this is what the author is showing, that Elizabeth is managing to drag it out for another year. And so that's the obvious, well, not obvious, but I mean, this is what I see there. But of course, there is more to it than that. A lot of those elements where Ivan features, a lot of allusions in the play point to the period where Edward de Vere was courting his Rosaline and Vavassor.
Mm.
And that was the time he was alienated from his wife. Well, we know that their love story also ended as a breakup. So there is this very sad song. There are two songs, after men and women separate, there is this, the actors come on the stage and they sing the song of spring, which is called the Song of Ver, V-E-R. And then, and that's all about love and frolicking in the fields and the flowers and although cuckoo reminds one of being cuckolded. But then there is the winter song, which is everything's very cold, and Greasy Joan is cooking something in a pot, and a man, the servant brings in wood to heat up the house, and it's very sad ending, and it's the song of winter, which in French is hiver. So both songs kind of, to me, they shout who the author is. Uh, I wrote of spring, I enjoyed spring, and now I'm suffering the winter.
Well, I
Is the
can't relate
winter of
because
our
we live in
discontent.
California, so it's not like Russia or Europe, I guess. Rima, thank you so much for talking to us today. I will heavily encourage folks to pick up your book. We'll have links in the description: Shakespeare, Elizabeth and Ivan, The Role of English, Russian Relations in Love's Labor's Lost. It has been so wonderful speaking to you, and thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me over, and yeah, I enjoyed it tremendously. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rima.
Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more about Edward de Vere and the Shakespeare authorship question, and follow me on TikTok at Phoebe de Vere.